people who can't take advantage of home working, people who drive trains, people who drive buses, people who work in hospitals and so forth, they are in effect, losing out in this, and they'll have to be compensated for in some way.
We see this across a lot of employment mandates, that actually often harms those that it's designed to help.
Which suggests that people regard the ability to work at home, for example, as worth a pay increase of 5, 6, 7%, something of that order. Which means, of course, that they're getting a sort of hidden pay increase.
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. I'm Callum Price, Director of Communications here. Today we're going to be talking about a new paper we are launching looking at the effects of flexible working mandates from the government and what effect they have on the labour market and what the government should be doing slightly differently. Now, I'm delighted to be joined by Len Shackleton and Annabel Denham, who are both co-authors of the report. Annabel is formerly of this parish and is now a columnist at the Telegraph. Len, of course, is our editorial and research fellow. Now, Len, could you open with a bit of a scene setter for us? What is the government doing on flexible working and why does it matter?
In the Employment Rights Act, which the government has just pushed through Parliament, the mandate about flexible working has been tightened. It's now very difficult for employers to refuse requests for flexible working. And we argue in this paper that this has hidden costs, which, although flexible working may be of considerable benefit to individuals, there are knock-on effects which are not so nice.
So we did have, or do have, the right to request flexible working, but the change that the government has made has basically made it extremely difficult for those requests to be denied.
Yes, that's right. You've always had to justify turning down a request for flexible working. But now the way in which you can do this has been considerably tightened, and you have to produce evidence that you've tried all sorts of different ways of dealing with it, that you've fully consulted and so forth.
But and if you, I assume there's all sorts of risk about being taken to tribunals and things if you don't.
Oh, indeed. And there have been many cases where people have been taken to tribunals, particularly where you can bring in things like protected characteristics, which open up the whole business of discrimination, where, of course, what you can be forced to pay out there is no limit to that. There's no upper limit to discrimination claims. So if you can claim that your request for flexible working was turned down because it's an unfair treatment of somebody who has a protected characteristic, then you're talking about really big money. And so employers are increasingly worried about this threat, and they feel that they have to give in to flexible working, even if it incurs considerable cost to them.
So it's effectively a right to flexible work, whether businesses like it or not. What do you think the effect will be on businesses and on employment more broadly because of this?
Well, listening to Len there, the first thing that sprung to mind was why, if an employer has two CVs which are near identical and is faced with a choice between somebody who has a protected characteristic and somebody who doesn't, wouldn't they choose the latter candidate because they're less likely to open themselves up to potential legal action down the line? And we see this across a lot of employment mandates, that actually often harms those that it's designed to help. So, for instance, working mums, they might be more likely to put in a request to work flexibly or work remotely or condensed hours or 4-day weeks, and they might want to finish a little bit earlier one day in order they can pick their child up from school or from their childcare setting. But again, will they have fewer opportunities because they are a working parent? And an employer is sitting there thinking, I'd love to take this person on, give them this opportunity, but am I at risk in so doing? And no employer really wants to roll the dice and go to the employment tribunal. Many of them will find themselves settling before that point, however illegitimately think that the claim might be. So, that's just one of many hidden costs, I think, associated with this new right to flexible work, which at surface level, on the face of it, has obvious appeal.
Yeah, so it's a good example of the government sort of putting its hand on the tiller of the incentives within the labour market, but then that effectively meaning that the businesses who respond to those incentives will respond in a way that harms workers, employees, and people with protected characteristics. Will it have an effect, do you think, Len, in the long term on employment more broadly?
I think one of the things which we try to point out in this paper is the knock-on consequences in terms of upsetting relativities within the labour market. So, for example, if we mention calculations which suggest that people regard the ability to work at home, for example, as worth a pay increase of 5, 6, 7%, something of that order, which means, of course, that they're getting a sort of hidden pay increase. Whereas people who can't take advantage of home working, people who drive trains, people who drive buses, people who work in hospitals and so forth, they are in effect, losing out in this, and then have to be compensated for in some way. Otherwise, the labour market effects are going to be that people are only going to work in that type of job rather than that type of job and so forth. So it creates knock-on effects like this. And when you add into that, particularly in the public sector, where you've got these rigid pay relativities, then this is going to create all sorts of problems across the labour market. So it's a more subtle thing, I think, than simply saying that, we're not arguing against flexible working, but what we are arguing for is to say that this should be decided between employers and employees. It should not be the government involvement in any way, in effect, as you were saying, having their hand on the tiller. That should not be the case.
Let's want to talk a little bit about the public sector specifically, because the public sector has a sort of a big productivity problem anyway.
Yeah.
And this is the area in which it might actually affect the government's bottom line, the government's sort of where the government has to bear the costs. Do we think that the government departments will be departments, arm's length bodies, quangos, etc.? Do you think that they will sort of be welcoming this news as much as, or rejecting this news as much as private sector companies are as well?
I think the public sector really has a different mindset. The civil servants who run it, the HR professionals who have such a strong influence these days in the civil service, they tend to focus on these issues about making people happy and all this sort of stuff. Ultimately, the taxpayer picks up the tab for all this, and that's really something which we ought to be focusing on.
I think one thing I would just sort of add to that is when you look at a lot of the surveys that are out there of flexible working and whether it enhances productivity and can therefore improve a business's bottom line, those who are responding often aren't on the front of house side of a particular company, rather they are in HR, or indeed they're the employees of the company who might benefit themselves from flexible working. So often it throws up some quite skewed data. Now, that isn't to say that enhanced well-being wouldn't make a particular employee more productive, but it could have the reverse effect. I mean, we've had some pretty small studies, shall we say, or surveys into the number of people who admit to watching television, for instance, when they are working from home. Now, you can't take these things too seriously, but you can see why perhaps people would have a slightly looser sort of relationship with work. If they were from home, there isn't somebody breathing down their neck. But equally, some people will be more productive if they can work in fits and starts. So it just re-emphasises Len's point that it ought to be a matter between the employer and the employee, and it shouldn't be something that could be implemented too quickly before an employer has a sense of whether it's appropriate for that particular staff member to be working flexibly in some way.
Yeah, exactly. So as Len pointed out, we're not necessarily criticising work from home or flexible working more broadly in and of itself. But what the paper does point out is that there are some costs to working from home or flexible working more broadly. And the government putting their hand on the tiller basically ignores those costs. But can you just walk us through what the evidence does say about working from home broadly? There are links to health problems and things like that. What is that evidence?
Oh, there is some significant evidence that there are health problems associated with working in isolation, mental health problems and so forth. Now, there are also physical health problems because, one of the things which employers have to do, of course, is have full concern for health and safety of people who are working for them. And in the workplace, this is fairly easy to do because you can observe people, you can see that they've not got the right equipment, they've not got the right chairs, they're not sitting in a comfortable environment, or whatever it may be. You're not able to do this with home workers on anything like this scale. And so you are getting problems of people with back problems and things like this, as well as the sort of mental health problems.
And you really saw that during lockdown as well, when people were forced to work from home and a lot of them were hunched over the kitchen table, and you saw the sharp increase in the number of people complaining about musculoskeletal problems. Another slightly tangential issue, I think, which Rishi Sunak was quite brave in pointing out, is that it's quite detrimental to younger, more junior employees to be working remotely because they just don't get that exposure to more senior staff members from whom they can learn. So that could have some sort of effect on their career progression in addition to their mental well-being and that sense that they're learning, they're advancing in their careers.
And when you add that on top of lots of other things the government is doing on minimum wage and employers' national insurance, it is the those sort of young, early entrants into the labour market that are really sort of feeling the brunt of this, which is interesting. Annabel, you're a political commentator for Telegraph, amongst other things. What are the politics of this? Do you think it's a sort of vote winner? Is it being dictated by unions, or is there something else to it?
I think that it's very much played into Angela Rayner's hands. She was the champion of the Employment Rights Act, was the one who wanted to strengthen the power of the unions and to enhance workers' rights. She talked a lot about how they were the first government to be strengthening those rights in the last few decades. So I think it enabled Keir Starmer in some ways to keep the left flank of the Labour Party on side. But, you had a lot of businesses screaming for the government to change course. And that was one of the reasons why immediately after Labour came into power, you saw the bill, as it was then, being watered down as they began to capitulate to some of the pressure that they were inevitably coming under. And that ought to have been a warning sign for them that there were costs, even if they were hidden, associated with this legislation. And now the party, which, Rachel Reeves went on the smoke salmon offensive before the general election and was able to win over a lot of business figures, is now finding that it's not especially popular with those same businesses having, as you said, brought in increases to the minimum wage, a massive increase in employers' national insurance contributions, and now the Employment Rights Act. But I think it has helped them to keep the unions, to keep the left of the Parliamentary Labour Party content, and they will continue to present this as a piece of legislation that boosts productivity, even if that's not supported by the evidence.
One of the things in the debate around the Employment Rights Act, one of the things which was dropped from that was the so-called right to disconnect, which is something which has been pushed quite a lot by trade unions. Prospect, for example, is one of the unions which is interested in that. Unison is another. And the idea here is that the employer should not be able to contact you outside defined hours. This has been dropped, but on the other hand, ACAS are being asked to produce a code of practice on the right to disconnect, which is going to have, I think, very much the same effect. And this is something which hasn't been talked about a great deal, but I think will create a lot of problems because this right to disconnect will interfere with some of the other things that are to do with flexible work. For example, flexi time. In fact, you've got some people working these hours, other people working these hours. And so you've got a very narrow band where you could, you could connect. So I think that's a problem. Could I just mention also in passing, we talked about the public sector before, and there is this interesting business of the 4-day week, which has been introduced in South Cambridgeshire local authority, and that has actually worried the Labour Party because Steve Reid, is it the community secretary, has come out against this very strongly and said that if other local authorities try doing this without, fully going through the thing, he's going to use powers to take over the running of these areas. So clearly there is some concern amongst sensible people within the government about this.
That's very interesting. What does the evidence show on 4-day weeks that we have at the moment in terms of effect on productivity, etc.?
That's your you wrote the section on the 4-day week.
Well, again, I think it's the familiar story of workers reporting that they can be more productive working 80% of the week than they are 100% of the week. I think the first question in response to that ought to be, what were you doing previously for 20% of the working week if you're able to do the same amount of work in just 4 days? So again, it sort of depends on who you listen to. Insofar as there have been pilots, you need to be very wary of the Hawthorne effect, which is that people for a fixed period of time, knowing that this trial is underway, will work more productively, but they will quickly slip back into old habits once they're given those 4 days a week, when they've had their reward at the end. So, again, it depends on which sector it is, which industry it is, who these workers are, and whether the sort of work that they're doing is compatible with condensing their hours or doing a 4-day week altogether. It's very difficult if you're a surgeon, for instance, or a fireman to work just a 4-day week. So it's sort of it's really mixed, and it really depends. But I can see where Steve Reed is coming from at a time when public sector productivity has really struggled to reach pre-COVID levels. I'm not sure that the right response to that is to reduce their hours.
What are the sort of overall effects on growth of the flexible working right, but also more broadly the Employment Rights Act, do we think? I mean, so far the OBR have refused to do a proper assessment of it, but they will presumably before the next fiscal statement. What assessment have you made, either in detail or in the broader sense, as to the effect it will have on our growth rates?
I don't think there's. Well, it's very difficult because you've got no counterfactual on this. You don't know quite what would have been the case given other circumstances. It's difficult to see that this focus on employee well-being, although it's that's something we expect to achieve as a byproduct of economic growth. Historically, if we look at the improvement in working conditions, if we look at the improvement, the reduction in working hours, and this is associated with increasing productivity. And that's the only way it can be afforded in the long run. We can fudge these things and say, yes, we can, the taxpayer can pay a little bit more to finance a better deal for people working in the public sector or whatever. But you can't run away from the fact that if you're looking at long-run economic growth, we've got to find ways to incentivize people, to incentivize businesses to get the economy going. You don't do this by saying, well, take the afternoon off. Mm-hmm.
One of the interesting things I looked at on the employment rights when it was a bill and the economic analysis that the government did, they pointed to a piece of evidence that suggested that employee satisfaction could lead to an increase in productivity. But when you go look under the bonnet of that, employee satisfaction is almost entirely defined by pay, which presumably things like employment rights mandates and flexible work mandates will have a negative effect on.
Well, exactly. It's the knock-on effect of increased regulation is often that wage growth slows and costs go up for consumers. Businesses will struggle to stay afloat. If they're forced to close, then everybody loses. Just add to Len's comments that we've sort of moved into this situation where increasingly we view employers as unscrupulous and exploitative, and I worry that a lot of the language around things like the Employment Rights Act just feed that idea, and we lose sight of the fact, and many Labour figures have advanced this case, such as Frank Field, that work is actually fundamentally good for you, that work in and of itself and the structure that it provides, and there's the social element to it, is very important for people's sense of self-worth and ultimately their well-being. And it's just a strange detachment that we seem to have between the two, which is, employers must exist in order to enhance the well-being of their staff, but employment in and of itself can be detrimental to people's well-being, and maybe their backs are being trampled on by exploitative businesses and bosses. And it's just a strange narrative that we seem to be hearing at the moment.
Do you think there's any hope of that narrative reversing anytime soon?
I think, a lot of it will depend on what happens at the next general election and whether a right-wing party is able to come back into power and reverse some of this stuff. But it's hardly as though the previous Conservative governments were averse to increasing regulation across the board, including employment regulations. So I've not got much hope.
Nor have I. There is a very strong ratchet effect on all these things. It's very difficult to say, okay, we're going to take away, a right which you've previously had. I think you have to be much more positive going forward, as Annabel says, stressing the positives of employment. And this is particularly, something we haven't mentioned is the exit from the workforce. Very large numbers of people, particularly young people, and somehow or other we've got to motivate them to get back into work, and to motivate employers, of course, to be willing to take them on, which means no more regulation, which is actually going to make it harder for employers.
And no more increases to the national minimum wage in particular, I would say, because the fact that that's now being levelled for young people with the rest of the workforce, a lot of employers will write into the Telegraph, for instance, telling us that they have no incentive now to try out a young person who's just come out of school or university against somebody who's in their late 20s with a few years of experience under their belt, because the cost of employing these two people is the same.
Mm-hmm. So Len, just before we wrap up, could you give us what you would do from the ground up, how you would build the government's approach to flexible working?
I think we shouldn't turn this into an anti-flexible working thing. There are advantages to individuals. There are, in some circumstances, advantages to employers. But what we have to do is to have a proper and honest evaluation of the whole picture. Not only the benefits, but also the costs, the direct costs in terms of how you actually set up a flexible working environment, and the indirect costs, the knock-on effects on the rest of the labour market. And the government needs to be much more clear-headed about this and be willing to stand back from this and let employers and employees get on with it.
Sounds like a good plan. Thank you both for joining us. Thank you too for watching. If you want to get all of our stuff straight to your inbox, then subscribe to us on Substack at insider.iea.org.uk. Subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts too. Thanks for joining, and we will see you next time.